In this movie, I'll show you the basics of working inside the Edit Colors dialog box, which allows you to modify entire collections of colors at a time. And you can start from one of the 23 harmony rules, or you can work from an existing color group. And you do so visually, directly inside that lab color wheel that I showed you a few movies ago. And here's how it works. You start off inside the swatches panel, click on a folder that represents an existing group, and then click on the circular Edit Color icon down here at the bottom of the panel. Or perhaps more simply, just go ahead and double-click on the folder in order to bring up the Edit Colors dialog box. And notice I'm working inside that same lab color wheel that I showed you a few movies back. And to make that more clear, I'll just go ahead and crank this brightness value right here in the middle of the dialog box up all the way, so we're seeing the top slice in a three-dimensional lab color cylinder. All right, now notice if I go ahead and drag this base color around, so this big circle, by the way, represents the base color, then all the other colors are going to move along with it. And so currently, I'm modifying the hue of this color by dragging around the circle, as well as its saturation by dragging outward in order to increase the saturation, or inward to decrease the saturation. And notice that changes the hue and the saturation of all of the other slave colors as well. It's different if you drag a slave. Notice if I drag this guy, I will change the hue values, by default anyway, of the other colors, but I will not change their saturation. Another thing you can do is work from one of the 23 harmony rules, and you do that by clicking on this down pointing arrow and choosing the desired rule. So for example, let's say I grab Tetrad 2, which I demonstrated for you once again a few movies ago, and I drag the base color over to that shade of blue. You can see that all the colors move around as well. We could drag this guy independently if you want to in order to change his saturation. And then also notice that if you drag the opposite color, everybody moves around. But if you drag either of these side colors, then you're going to move them up and down as if they're some kind of arms. And so let's say you want to check out one of the ones that didn't really detail, then just go ahead and click the down pointing arrowhead once again and choose, let's say, Tetrad 3. And you can see now if you drag one of the side handles, the other one moves in the opposite direction. And my favorite, just for goofing around, is Pentagram, by the way, which has a head, of course, up there at the top. But I'll just go ahead and move the base color to the top like so. And then you can drag the arms and legs up and down as if you're looking at some kind of colorful Vitruvian man. So again, I encourage you to experiment with those if you're so inclined. Now, let's say you want to save what you've done so far as a color group. Then go ahead and give this guy a name such as, let's say, Custom Pentagram, and then click on a little folder icon in order to create a new group as we're seeing right here. But what I really want to do is start with Baroque 6. So I'll just go ahead and click on it once again to load it up, and then I'll start dragging this base color around. And I want you to notice that I'm seeing HSB sliders, which stand for hue, saturation, and brightness. You could just as easily work with some other color space, such as RGB. We've got CMYK. We have the 216 colors in the old style web safe palette. And then we have Lab. Now, Lab is probably the toughest of the color models, even though we're actually looking at a lab wheel here. And again, I'm just going to crank that brightness value up so that we can see the top slice in the cylinder. And so we've got a luminance value right here, which allows you to change the brightness or darkness of those colors. And notice that the wheel is going to catch up with us after I make my modification. But I'm just going to go ahead and crank it up a little bit so we have some bright colors. And then we've got A and B, which are more commonly known, by the way, as tint and temperature, if you're familiar, for example, with Camera Raw or Lightroom or one of those programs. And so if I increase this A value all the way up to 127, and I set the B value to 0, just for the sake of demonstration here, then I'm going to move the base color to more or less the right side of the circle. If I take this A value down all the way, I'm going to move it over to the left side of the circle. All right, let's just go ahead and zero that out so I can show you what happens with B. If I crank the value up, then we're going to move the base color to the top of the circle, again, más o menos. And if I reduce that value to negative 128, I'm going to move the base color to the bottom of the circle. But HSB is really the most predictable way to work because, for example, if I take the saturation value down, then I'm going to move the colors in toward the center. If I take it up, I'm going to move the colors out to the perimeter. And if I modify the hue value, then I'm going to spin all the colors around the circle like so, which might make you say, well, Deke, then obviously this is not a lab color wheel. It's an HSB wheel. Well, not really. HSB is not technically a color model. It's a kind of different language that translates into either RGB or, in our case, lab. And to demonstrate that, I'll go ahead and change the hue value to 0 degrees. And notice that moves my base color to the right side of the circle, just as I was showing you in those diagrams, which is red. Whereas if I take it up to 60 degrees, which is yellow, that goes ahead and cranks it all the way beyond 90 degrees, which is straight up, over into something neighboring 110 degrees on the circle. And that's because we're not looking at an RGB or CMYK wheel, and we're most certainly not looking at an HSB wheel. We're looking at a lab color diagram. And to make it even more clear, I'll change this value, the hue value that is, to 180 degrees, which should be halfway around the circle on the left-hand side. But instead, we move past that point and down a little bit to something nearer to 200 degrees. Anyway, just something to bear in mind. All right, I'm going to go ahead and drag these guys around to a different position, let's say. And I want you to notice one more thing. It's very possible, by the way, that the saturation value isn't always going to track correctly, in which case, if you click on it and press the tab key, you're going to mess up that color. I want to go ahead and take it back down to a lower saturation value. Now let's say I want to take this guy right here, which has a hue value of about 40 degrees. And instead of just dragging that circle around, which is going to modify the hue and saturation values, I want to lock down the hue value, which is down 47.5 degrees. And you do that by pressing and holding the shift key as you drag. And that'll lock down the hue, and in this case, just modify the saturation value. At which point you might wonder, well, what about brightness? How do I modify the brightness value, except manually, of course? Well, you go ahead and click on this icon, which shows brightness and hue on the wheel, as opposed to saturation and hue. And now you can drag these guys around, and notice the saturation value remains fixed, and the hue and the brightness values change. Not in any kind of actual reliable way here, so I'll press the tab key in order to increase everybody's brightness, and then I'll reduce this guy again. If you want to lock down the hue value, which is currently 251.77 degrees, then press and hold the shift key as you drag, and you'll modify the brightness value by itself. If you want to modify the saturation of the entire color wheel, you now drag what was formerly a brightness control and is now turned into a saturation control. My guess, however, is that most of the time you're going to want to edit the saturation and hue values and then just change the brightness value manually. All right, so let's say about, I don't know, something like this, that I end up with a group of colors that I like. Then I could either save over Baroque 6, or I could create a new color group by changing this guy's name to alternative colors or something like that. And then instead of clicking here, which is going to save over the other color group, go ahead and click on the folder icon in order to create a new one. And then, assuming that you're done, go ahead and click OK in order to add those color groups to the swatches panel. And that is how you work inside the Edit Colors dialog box in order to modify an entire collection of colors at a time, either based on one of the 23 harmony rules or based on an existing color group here inside Illustrator.